the EU will become Belgium, and this is not a good thing. So the problem with Belgium, even though it's technically a real country, is that it's sitting in this anachronistic space of a vestige nation state. It lacks any authenticity from a global perspective because of its inability to project itself seriously internationally, and it maintains its relevance only by being the office space for the EU. In one way or another, you will see the dissolution probably of Belgium for all intents and purposes of the next century, because there's an insanely weak constitutional monarchy system in place which will kowtow to any whim that the EU might have of it. And in its annexation to the EU as a bloc, which you probably will see, and or how it functions as a superficial client state for the American EU global hegemony going forward. And that's to say, what was a country and what was a particularly, I'd say, notable and worthwhile nation state in the 19th century has turned into a bit of a joke. They've gone more than at some point 2 years without a government, basically, and no one really cared because it's not a real country, and no country which is an actual country could ever function without a government. But obviously a country that's a simulacra or a joke can absolutely function like that. And so, being facetious aside, it's to say, what's the problem with Belgium? Why is it such a farcical nation? It's not that it doesn't have lovely things, and in particular, it's obviously still got that cozy European heritage whereby you can go and experience a different culture. They have their beer and their waffles and their fries and their castles. I think there's the most castles per square kilometre, and that should actually tell you something about Belgium as a sufferer and stalwart against war in that region, is that you don't have that many castles unless you have a lot of war. And so having to live through all those wars, particularly through the separation of the Netherlands in the 18th century, and before that with the Spanish occupation, the French, etc. So they've experienced quite a lot of tumultuous times in Belgium, which has hardened them into what was the Belgian Empire to a degree. But now obviously it's because it's decayed to this bureaucratic office state, then that's what you'll see in terms of reflected in its nationhood, what it is. It's had a large influx of immigrants, similar to both France and Netherlands, with a lot of MENAPT immigrants making a lot of social problems, particularly around crime and exploitation of social services, healthcare, welfare, all that sort of fraud. But in general, they also have what I would consider as one of the worst economies in Europe, because it's a bit of a false economy in a way. It's artificial because it's 75% or so of its services are generated out of the bureaucratic process of the EU. So you can see here that 57% of GDP is government expenditure, plus 1% of their GDP is actual pass-through. So if you didn't know, the Belgium as a country is actually a net detractor for the EU. It takes in more money than it gives in, even though they have what is effectively the highest tax rate in almost the world. So because of the OECD, how that works, but you basically see here is that the Belgians get less money and give all their money to the state, and the state still is incapable of generating enough GDP in that way to contribute to the EU. They actually still have to be funded, and that's not, as I said, considering the services offered. A lot of the professional services, because Belgium's economy is about 77-80% services, they almost make nothing themselves and export nothing, except maybe chocolate and beer. So the idea that they're a service economy is fine, but the services all attend toward the one process, which is the EU function. EU is obviously a large bloated bureaucratic body, and so a lot of that is wastage and spillage into the broader Belgian economy, which is services, and that can go into consulting firms and engineering and other types of firms, which particularly IT, things like that, which go into the broader economy as a totality. But obviously it's very not value adding. It's all this circular economy where it's almost tautological, is that you spend the money to continue to generate the money, to spend the money to continue to generate the money. There's no actual value creation. It's all just this artificial lie. And so when you do that and you have that as your economy, then you don't necessarily have an attachment, an association to anything properly. There's no industrial capacity, there's no army, there's no threats because you are as I said before, a bureaucratic office state. And this goes back into how this happened. How do you have what was particularly an important and historically significant country slide into what is now irrelevancy? Well, it basically can be thought of as a totem, or at least the vestigial totem of what was the 18th century Europe, in that you had what was a large-scale bifurcation of Europe from the religious side of things. So you had Protestantism, which was born out in Germany, obviously, but then you had 300 years of war of Catholics versus Protestants. And this separation of the two, to a large degree, has allowed Belgium to exist as a state by itself, because it was mainly Catholic. And obviously when it was embedded into the Netherlands, then it was considered probably anathema to them to have to deal with Protestant-led king, government, everything like that. And so they fought for their own independence and won, which is obviously very glorious, and the attributes to them should speak volumes of how nationhood should make you feel, is that if you feel in your heart that something needs to be done by force and war, then you will do it and you will win. But the resultant effect is that you have now an ethnic divide. So you have Catholic Dutch, and then you have what you would say is Catholic French splitting a country. And now when you have that, then you have a new tribal war, which is to say the lazy French and the productive Dutch now have, you could call it half friendly, half very serious, low, almost cold war against each other, where they have a bipartisan affair of one wants one thing and the other. But it's also subsumed into the broader, as I said before, EU notion of Belgium as a country that serves the EU. There's no way you can partition Belgium out of these two states, because it's insignificant to bother doing so. You would think from if you could relate to it in the Russian perspective, they would annex Ukraine because they feel as if there's many Ukrainians, which are actually Russians, and that the territory belongs to the ethnic enclave of whoever's the predominant resident there. So the denizens here, obviously, as I said before, Dutch and or at least Dutch-speaking and French-speaking, but at the same time, or some German-speaking as well in the east there. But in the saying of why would you bother, you wouldn't. Would you want the burden of having... well, in this case, Wallonian France, which no, you wouldn't if you were France, because it's just going to be a cost center. There's no need to annex, there's no want and drive to have that ethnic suzerainty for you, because it serves no economic purpose to do it, and you get nothing out of that. Having nice fancy castles and Belgian waffles is not something that anyone cares to bother with. It's the same reason that Luxembourg still exists. It's respected to exist. It doesn't obviously functionally exist from an international political standpoint. No one actually cares about Luxembourg except as a tax residency. And the same thing, no one really cares about Belgium except as a holiday destination and or the welfare state for the EU. And so in doing that, you've made a farcical arrangement about an entire nation, about an entire country. It has grown into this joke. And then knowing this, you can start to attribute the same factors and parameters to the broader EU project, which is to say, once you have this lack of identification around what makes a nation and a state, because you've started to agglomerate different types of people into an artificial drawing, into a map here, then there's nothing binding them together in any national sense. And so no leader can stand out. So you're seeing the same thing in Canada, where you have this notion of French Canada from natural Canada. No actual ethnic nation has this differentiation to a large degree. So in, say, the UK, maybe you have Cornwall or you have Northumbrians, but they really are just English, and there's no separatist movements for that sense, and there's no divergence from their national identity in a meaningful way. And the same thing can be said in Denmark. You have Jutlanders and Zeelanders, and the same thing in, say, Sweden, where you have the Geats and the Swedes. But in general, these are all fairly familial relations, which still are subsumed by, or at least subordinate to, the monarch, to the executive state. In Belgium, you can't have that. You have two very clashing cultures here, one Dutch Catholic and the other French Catholic, and the ethnicity here is much more important than the co-religion. It's not to say that they are ethnically that different, but it is to say that there's a mentality around this that cannot be reconciled under a leader. A leader can't be half Wallonian, half Flemish, and then have the ability to lead them in a way that's an effective nation. So you may as well dissolve it. You may as well dissolve the constitution, the monarchy, and just get rid of the state entirely and just call it the EU Office 1, EU Region 1. That's all it is. And effectively, and this may be disappointing to Belgium citizens. But at the same time, what is your identity? It's nothing. There is nothing here to be beholden to. There's a historical vestige of what was Belgium as a catalogue of events of historical ties, but there's no concurrent existing sentiment to the nationhood of being Belgium. It's just not there. You're either French, basically, or Dutch, basically, or German. So in saying that is, think the stage we are at in the EU was probably Belgium 40 years ago. After the Second World War, it just became built upon this idea that it's a stopgap. It's this post-nationhood of a state, and you can now start to think, okay, well, if that's how this operates, then the broader EU without any leader, because there's no coherence around leadership, there's no one identifying principle. Being European is meaningless. It's just a term that has been thrown around for the last 100 years. There's no historical meaning to being European. If you're talking about being white, or you're talking about being Germanic, or you're talking about being Celtic, then for sure. But the idea of Europeanhood is only out of, say, Woodrow Wilson's 1920s treatment of Europe as a totality versus the America as a totality, and this bipolar relationship. But in this actual instance, we actually don't have Europeans. You have a demarcation of Europe on a map, and then the EU has tried to, what is the European brotherhood, but there's either a fatherland or there isn't when it comes to nationhood. And if you don't understand that, then you will not understand how the next 50 years is going to go, particularly for something like the EU as a bureaucratic function. It will just start to subsume these countries into economic zones with no actual identity. And if you want to avoid that, if you actually cherish your history as a nation of citizen, that's why you would want the EU to fail, because it doesn't bind anyone to anything. A greater Deutschland or a greater Denmark or a greater England actually has an idea, an identity attached to it. But the EU is the most materialistic, superficial void of any feeling and purpose. It just becomes what I would say is a soulless husk of state and of a leadership and of being and belonging.